Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Ransomware Preparedness Seminar entitled, Welcome to Your Worst Day Ever. My name is David Finn. I'm the Executive Vice President of Strategic Innovation at CynergisTek. And just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we will do our best to address them during the allocated Q&A at the end of the session. CynergisTek, for your information, is a top-ranked cybersecurity and privacy consulting firm offering specialized services and solutions to help organizations achieve, mature, and maintain privacy, security, and compliance goals. While CynergisTek was born in healthcare, our expertise and breadth of experience touches all regulated industries and all sectors across the continuum. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the agenda, the things you're going to hear covered today, some introductions, ransomware case studies, next steps. This is about preparedness and runbook and best practices, as well as some insights and support from the FBI, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A from the audience. We have some great presenters today, starting with the CEO of CynergisTek, Caleb Barlow. Caleb joined us from IBM, where he was VP of Threat Intel and ran the X-Force division of IBM. Also joining us is Doug Domin, Supervisory Special Agent of the FBI within the Criminal Computer Intrusion Squad. And Doug has been with the FBI since 2002 and has a lot of experience in cybersecurity. Before I hand off here, I just want to hit some statistics. You're going to hear a lot of these, but the Department of Health and Human Services published in February of this year a snapshot of healthcare in 2020. And some of the most striking statistics were, and they sourced this from multiple areas, but VMware and Carbon Black provided input that said 239.4 million cyber attacks were attempted in 2020. That's an average of 816 attempted attacks per healthcare endpoint, which represents nearly a 10,000% increase from 2019. 560 healthcare organizations were impacted, and that means they had some kind of shutdown. That doesn't just mean they found ransomware, that means there was a kinetic impact on the organization. The Wall Street Journal reported that 1 million healthcare records were breached each month last year. And I don't need to remind you of some of the issues we've had. The patient in Germany who died when he was rerouted because hospital was down due to ransomware. We've seen ransomware as a service become kind of standardized. We've seen double extortion emerging. And of course, the COVID-19 themed attacks have been growing, and we see them in increasing numbers today. There's a lot of things you can do, and this is about, we're talking about preparedness today, and this is really about resilience and validation. Security is complicated, technology is complicated, but the answers often are pretty simple. It's taking the questions and making them less complicated and complex. We look at everything across the spectrum, from security assessment and testing to professional services, to managed security services and privacy services. We also have incident response services that run the gamut from plans to exercises to actual recovery services. But the core of everything we do is validation, and that's validating that the people, the processes, and the technology are working as you plan and hope for. And that's really the goal here, and that's the key to preparedness, making sure you've got everything set the way you want and that it works. And at this point, I'm going to hand off without further ado to Caleb. Just let me know when you want a slide, Caleb. Thanks.
All right, thanks, David. So ransomware attacks cost the healthcare industry $20.8 billion in downtime in 2020, which is double that from the year before. And it's not unusual to see healthcare being targeted. Let's face it, it's been one of the most targeted industries for years. But most of what we've historically seen has been less about bad guys, locking up systems, and more about stealing data. And bad guy goes in, steals medical records, posts them on the dark web, sells them, that type of thing. And let's face it, healthcare largely transferred the risk of these incidents of exfiltration to cybercrime. But now as ransomware has really taken off and as bad guys are targeting electronic medical records to lock them up with ransomware, now we have a different problem in that the entire system often is locked up and unable to operate. So I want to start off today by taking a look at some of the marquee ransomware incidents from the last year and a half and what we can learn from them. So let's go ahead to the next slide, and we start with VCPI. Now, VCPI, they run the IT systems for 100 clients that serve 2,400 nursing homes in 45 states. And when hit with a ransomware incident, and this was back in November of 2019, they declined to pay the reported $14 million ransom. Now, in this case, it had a direct impact to electronic medical records, email, and phone service, taking them all down. Identity and password data was harvested by the bad guys for more than 300 third-party services. And when they refused to pay the ransom, the bad guys started posting this data. And remember, this was a cloud provider, so it had a pretty large blast radius impacting hundreds of nursing homes all at once that, again, could not get access to their electronic medical records. So they refused to pay, and then the bad guys pivot to release the data in what's now known as double extortion. And this was really the first high-profile case of double extortion. We then go from there, and if you can advance the slide, David, to UHS. And the situation at UHS was a little bit different. Up to the incident at UHS, attacks on healthcare were generally limited to a hospital, a clinic, or an office at a time. Not that these attacks didn't historically have a significant impact, but the blast radius was small. Again, it was kind of one institution at a time. Now, understand the targeting from these groups is not random. They spend time picking targets. So when UHS was taken down, this impacted around 250 of their 400 locations in the middle of a pandemic, taking out their entire IT system, including the phones. And, as security professionals, we've talked about, a quote unquote kinetic impact for years and what would happen if. Well, this was really, the first kinetic impact of magnitude. And it really marks a change in what I call adversarial intent. In this case, the adversary was knowingly attempting to take down an entire system, knowing that they would have a catastrophic impact on patient care and could potentially cause loss of life. Now, as you can imagine, this woke up the entire industry that they were now dealing with adversaries that felt empowered to take down an entire system, were operating with impunity, and were attempting to maximize the impact. In many opinions, this is the first breach that really starts to cross the line into this kind of large-scale kinetic impact. Now, the good news here is they did not appear to make it in the medical records. Those were apparently outsourced to a cloud provider. So in my opinion, this is the breach that really crosses the Rubicon in terms of adversarial intent. Had they gotten into the EMR, it would have been far worse. But even then, even just taking down the IT systems, the overall breach cost is estimated to be around $67 million. We go from there to then Dusseldorf University Clinic. Now, David mentioned this earlier. This is a clinic in Germany. A patient allegedly dies due to an emergency room diversion where they had to reroute in the ambulance to another facility 20 miles away, brought on by a ransomware incident that took down an emergency room. Now, there is some questioning of the accuracy of would the patient, would the patient have died anyway and all that good stuff. But, not to, I mean, at the end of the day, the point here is someone did die in the ambulance before they got to a hospital. And at this point, this incident really raises everyone's dander to recognize that ransomware is absolutely causing an impact on patient care. We go from there to the University of Vermont Health Network. Now, I got to set the stage here. When we get to the situation at University of Vermont Health Network, this was a few weeks before the US presidential election. And there was an attempted takedown of the TrickBot botnet by Microsoft, several industry partners, and it was rumored to even include participation from the US government. Now, the problem here is the takedown failed, but the private sector PR machine kicked into full high gear, likely taunting the adversary. And it's not known if this was retaliatory, but on October 29th, CISA, the FBI, the Department of Health and Human Services were warning of a significant attack on the healthcare sector, and this was very real, with more than 400 healthcare institutions in the crosshairs. Now, as the warnings go out, detonations were occurring, and by the time the dust settled, there were about a dozen hospitals that were impacted, the most significant of which was the University of Vermont Health System, where the adversary was successful in taking down the electronic medical record system. Now, this was so devastating. Just put this in perspective. The Vermont governor deployed the National Guard to help with the remediation. And the overall anticipated cost of just the situation in Vermont is over $64 million. They had to furlough or reassign 300 employees, touch 5,000 computers and 1,300 servers. The most significant impact, though, wasn't just to emergency. It also impacted oncology and imaging. I mean, think about it. If you've got an oncology patient, if you suddenly can't get access to that patient's history, whatever drug cocktail they're on, or worse yet, the imaging, it becomes really hard to treat patients. So this had a pretty significant impact on patient care. And it definitely got everyone in the healthcare industry thinking about threat intel and realizing also that, the old adage of prevention is certainly going to be a lot less expensive than a cure. So if we go from there, what happens next? Like, where does this go? What's actually going on the inside? And what does that business impact look like? So I now want to kind of show you this chart where, now these couple of slides, these were built out based on information from two separate healthcare organizations and what they went through. And this, by the way, is not any of the companies I've mentioned, any of the organizations I've mentioned so far. Now, please keep in mind that no two incidents are the same, and every organization's response is going to be different for a breach. But here's the point. This really starts to show you financially what's going on in a healthcare system. So let's dig a little deeper into this. So in the first 2 weeks, kind of the attack and the containment, immediately the EMR goes down. Now, what that means is claims processing stops, right? So if you don't have electronic medical records, you can't process claims, so you're not making money. But also at the same time, expenses are going up, both in overtime and outside assistance, response efforts, et cetera. And elective procedures are also diverted. So 14 days of paper orders, charges, and results while the EMR is down. Now, let me put this in perspective. Remember, healthcare has moved away from paper forms for a while. They start generating paper. It's enough to literally fill a conference room floor to ceiling with paper. And that happens over these 2 weeks. So during this time, there are also investigations that need to be conducted into determining if any patient healthcare information may have been compromised and if this is a reportable incident. Now, as we get into kind of remediation, so 2 weeks post the attack, the electronic medical record system comes back online, but at this point, cash reserves are depleted. And you can see that on this chart. All those paper documents all now have to be entered and scanned back into the system. So you now have to get, an army of contractors to take all of the paper in that conference room and put it into the EMR now that's back up so you can bill and get paid. And think about how long that takes, right? So we then get 9 weeks post the attack. The first claims are just starting to get paid. But at this point, the case deficit is over $100,000 per bed. At 26 weeks post-attack, the claims are finally submitted, but what they find is there's a 6 to 10% reduction in revenue due to lost charge capture while everyone was scrambling to put things in paper. So, this was roughly speaking 200 bed facilities in a competitive market. And at the end of the day, they just never fully recovered. So let's go on to the next chart. And let's take another kind of more in-depth view here. So, what have you got here? 2 weeks of full downtime. They have to open an incident command center 24/7. Paper processing for nearly everything. And now think about this as well. Younger staff has never worked on paper, right? I mean, thank goodness for older nurses. The newer staff just doesn't know how to paper chart. They need runners to go everywhere, pick up lab orders, et cetera, because, in a lot of cases, the phones aren't working, especially if they're voice over IP. Lots of confusion, tons of inconsistency, and backloading of data and charges. Now, most institutions have downtime boxes, right? If the EMR goes down, but those downtime boxes were only designed for 2 to 3 days. So they have to literally run out and print forms and prescription pads from a local printer to get what they can. Older versions of paper start getting used. They're literally going through the warehouse trying to find old paper forms that they can use. All things that most people probably really aren't thinking about. So if we kind of go from there into, let's talk a little bit about the recovery, if we can advance the slide. So the recovery really involves 14 days of these paper orders and charges that we talked about, but it takes about 4 months to match all those paper forms with patients, orders, and charges and get everything back in the system. It costs about an additional $250,000 to $500,000 in overtime, special services, and remediation assistance, not counting new security hardware or software or what you're paying your incident response team. You've got no claims processing for over 60 days. So what does that mean? No incoming cash flow. At the same time, you're having to take on all these additional expenses. You're losing about $2 million in revenue in this case. And now some of that is due to lost charge capture, but some of that's just due to elective procedures that never happened. And of course, at the same time, you've got your litany of IT projects that you would want to get done anyway, and those things get pushed out by several months. Now, the cleanup took a solid 4 months of enterprise-wide effort and was still happening 6 months post-event. Again, lots of confusion and inconsistency. Some departments and clinics enter their own backload of data, again, so you get lots of inconsistencies. Other groups brought in contractors. You still had a few groups that did nothing, which gets into all kinds of finger pointing, frustration, and delays. And even to this day, they're still kind of missing a charge here, an order there, a result there that just never got captured along the way. Okay, so let's kind of flip to the next chart. And well, why is all this happening, right? What's causing all this? Why is healthcare so routinely targeted? Well, 66% of America's healthcare providers don't meet the minimum standards as defined by the National Institute of Standards. Now, I'm oversimplifying this, but if you're familiar with the NIST cybersecurity framework, it looks at security controls in an institution, and a third-party assessor like our company rates the organization and the maturity of each of these controls. And it's done typically on a 1 to 5 scale. So if you basically assume a maturity level of 3 is minimal acceptable, and anyone that's familiar with the NIST cybersecurity framework would kind of drill and go, yeah, that's basically where you're getting started, is when you get to a score of 3. 66% of America's healthcare providers can't get to that level. And this is not a new problem, by the way. Now, to be clear though, this doesn't mean that people aren't investing in security. They are. They're just not investing fast enough to keep up with an adversary that in many cases is constantly changing their tactics. And we actually found, even in some of the latest data from 2019, some institutions, again, even though they're investing, are actually falling behind because the adversary is investing faster than they are. So simply put, healthcare is open, healthcare is vulnerable, and it's also heavily insured with cyber insurance and therefore very likely to pay a ransom. Okay, so how can we prevent ransomware? What are some of the things we can do? And fair warning, this is a little bit cheesy, but I've actually found this methodology to really play well in helping to explain in kind of a patient care metaphor what you need to take on when you're kind of trying to prevent ransomware. So it's also, frankly, a great way to explain security controls to a board. So continuing to use this healthcare metaphor, the reality is these actions could actually apply to any industry. But the first thing we need, just like in a pandemic, is testing. And testing is crucial to slow the spread. And as ransomware attacks increase in healthcare, the way you test is something called a compromise assessment. And what it does is it unearths if an organization is currently infected. It can also identify any potential weaknesses on your preparation and resiliency to withstand a breach. Now, a compromise looks at both endpoint and network security, along with known and unknown devices, to uncover malicious activity. And these assessments also increase the visibility to determine if teams have the right skills and tools on hand to quickly identify, contain, and remediate incidents. So again, a lot like testing in a pandemic, this screening is critical to effectively curb the spread of a virus, or in this case, ransomware. Now, the second thing we need, and you've certainly heard plenty of this over the last year, is social distancing. And ransomware can find its way into the most protected environment. So a defensive strategy is all about preventing a spread. Sound familiar? Just like COVID. So just like we see that social distancing need to prevent the spread of a biological virus, we need social distancing on our network. So if a single department of an organization gets infected, it's really imperative to stop the spread from infecting the entire organization. And network segmentation is what you need here. It divides that computer network into smaller parts, which can limit the harm caused by ransomware, and it can also accelerate your restoral time, because maybe you're only restoring one department versus every single computer in your environment. And if a network isn't segmented, that entire organization can go down, and there's really nothing to stop ransomware from spreading very rapidly. And of course, this also often results in massive payments to attackers to restore operational access. So in a digital world, this strategy allows these backend systems to be distanced as a means to prevent more damage from being done. And I'll tell you, in healthcare, where I really see challenges around network segmentation is, well, frankly, you can see it almost everywhere, but particularly, let's take an academic medical center. It's not uncommon for the university side of the institution to be directly connected to the healthcare side. And, I think a lot of the thought process there historically is, hey, surgeons are also teaching. They don't want to have to log in and have two sets of IDs. And of course, there are ways to deal with that. But historically, again, these networks are often flat. So an infection in the dorm room, the next thing you know is taking down your surgical suite. And that's exactly what we really need to avoid here with social distancing on your network. Now, the next thing we need is some contact tracing. And in a pandemic, individuals who's been exposed to the virus need to sequester themselves for a period of time to prevent the spread. Now, in a ransomware attack, the equivalent of contact tracing is what we call endpoint detection and response. So EDR tools provide telemetry, right? So that you can understand where an infection might be, breaking, and immediately quarantine those workstations or servers and everything that they've been connected to. Again, very analogous here to what we do with a biological virus, right? You've got to get that early warning indicator, rapidly quarantine anything that it's touched. And these EDR tools can really help triage the situation. I will tell you, I think this is probably one of the most common things I recommend when we're doing security assessments, is that healthcare institutions, if they don't have a real EDR tool, and I'm not talking antivirus, I'm talking endpoint detection response. You'll hear company names like CrowdStrike or Carbon Black or Cylance. Those are the types of things you want to be looking for. And then, continuing our metaphor, we of course need some masks, right? So PPE goes well beyond pandemics, and you need a digital mask to prevent networks from being corrupted. Now, in the security world, this is really multi-factor authentication. And, upon access, an adversary is going to immediately deploy tools to crack passwords and elevate their credentials. Cracking an 8 to 10 digit password can happen in a matter of minutes. But leveraging multi-factor authentication is going to really slow them down and, frankly, potentially cause them to move off to more vulnerable targets that aren't using multi-factor authentication. So extra protection is the name of the game in looking to prevent viruses from ravaging our physical and digital environments. Then we get to scrubs and gowns. Now, if medical professionals wore their everyday clothes in sterile settings, their clothing could introduce unwanted pathogens. So medical scrubs in a security world are best likened to something called privileged access management, or PAM. Now, what PAM does is it helps dial in the appropriate level of access controls to condense the organization's attack surface, preventing widespread damage from external attacks in addition to insider negligence. So think of it this way. We're talking about your admins here. You don't want your admins using the same user IDs for accessing their workstation and their email as they are for administering the environment. These things need to be separated. And in fact, a common practice is that there's a separate ID for administering every single server. So implementing a PAM tool, or at the very least conducting a PAM audit, again, privileged access management, can really help detect any loopholes in access for privileged users. It's also important to take all precautions available to reduce new outbreaks or attacks from occurring. Okay, then let's get to a checkup, right? You need an annual checkup, just like we go to our doctor and identify areas where people might need medical intervention, let's say a change in diet or exercise. And when it comes to understanding an organization's health of their people, processes, and technology, conducting something called a control validation assessment is critical. And it's just what the CISO ordered. What we're looking for here in control validation is to discover exactly what security controls are not performing as they were designed. And effectively what you're doing is launching inoculated ransomware or malware into the environment, monitoring, hey, did the intrusion prevention system detect it? Did the firewall detect it? Did it properly correlate in the SIM? Did the team that was on duty at 3 o'clock in the morning properly respond? Did they open a ticket? So that's what this kind of checkup process or security validation can do. Then we get to a treatment plan, and you build a treatment plan just like you would for overcoming a complex illness. And with ransomware, it's effectively going in and having those runbooks and playbooks in place so that you understand how to manage, respond, and recover from an attack a whole lot faster. And it's a lot like kind of like a vaccine here, right? I mean, vaccines aren't necessarily going to prevent you from getting infected. They're certainly going to reduce the chances, but they're definitely going to reduce the chances of a negative outcome. Same thing with having runbooks and kind of this treatment plan in place. You're going to dramatically reduce the blast radius and the impact of a negative outcome if and when you are breached. Okay, so let's talk about runbooks some more. And if we go to the next chart, in November of last year, when I was talking about that incident where more than 400 healthcare institutions were being targeted by TrickBot, I went out and offered to any of our clients that we'd review their runbooks free of charge, and with a specific focus on their readiness to handle a ransomware incident. Now, what was interesting for those institutions that even had runbooks, and by the way, most did not, what we found was incredibly consistent in terms of deficiencies. And I kind of summarize this up in what I call the 3 duties of any runbook. The first is the duty to respond. So what this is when that incident occurs at 3 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Eve, who detects and responds to the incident? How do they determine, and do they have the authority to elevate it and identify it as an incident of magnitude? Who makes that decision? You'd be amazed, most runbooks are completely silent on who makes the decision as to whether you have an incident of magnitude. And here's the problem. If you haven't, and actually you can advance to the next chart. If you haven't told your people and empowered them as to who's in charge of making that determination, again, at 3 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Eve, it usually just sits there. So understanding this duty to respond, empowering your people to press the big red button, if you will, when they see something that's unusual and they need help is incredibly important. And that decision-making process is missing in most of the runbooks we looked at. The second duty is what I call the duty to convene. And what this means is that when an incident of magnitude occurs, remember, time is the one thing you do not have a lot of, because you're up against a human adversary. They can see your response, they can pivot, they can jog. So the duty to convene is all about assembling the team. Who's on the team? How do you get them together? Again, 3 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Eve. What resources do you need, both internally and externally? And most importantly in that, do you have the people that can actually make the decisions? It doesn't do you any good to say that, hey, the CEO is in charge if they're on a plane halfway around the world for the next 12 hours. You need to be able to convene a team that can make the decisions in the crisis. And my rule always on this is your team is the team that's in the room, or whether it's a physical room or a virtual room, but your team are the people that responded, and that's who you have to make those decisions. So this idea of how do we even get together is really important. And I'll tell you, most runbooks I looked at have people get on a conference bridge using their phone system. Well, what happens if the phone system is down? Because it's one of the first things that usually drops in a ransomware incident. How do you get access to your runbooks, right? All of these things need to be available offline so that your team can convene in an emergency. And lastly, what I call the duty to act. Who makes the decisions? It's amazing how many runbooks would talk about the policies, but would never outline who actually makes the decisions. And I'm talking about everything from little decisions to say, hey, should we involve outside counsel, let's say, at this point in the incident? Do we need to bring in additional help? To big decisions like, are we going to pay a ransom? You don't want to be thinking about who's going to make that decision in the middle of the crisis. You want to have that all outlined ahead of time. You also need to think about how you handle lines of succession, right? Again, if the CEO is stuck on a plane for the next 12 hours, who's going to make the decision? Because not making a decision is a decision. And in most cases, it's a really bad one, especially when time is not your friend. So how do you make these decisions quickly and with limited data? The problem here is you're talking about crisis decision making. You don't have time to go out and hire a consultant and think about it and analyze it or wait till next Tuesday's staff meeting. You need to make decisions quickly, and having a good understanding of that duty to act and who's going to make those calls becomes critically important. And lastly, who can you call for help? And do you know how to call them when you need them? If we go to the next chart. So another area we found really lacking, in fact, this was lacking in 100% of the plans we looked at, is any concept of crisis communications. And understand, crisis communications are completely different than your normal enterprise communications, and it's an art form, particularly when it comes to responding to a cybersecurity incident. It's incredibly important to quickly assess the situation, engage legal, and be a source of information so you're controlling the message. But again, you got to remember, you're up against a human adversary that can see what you're doing. You've got to remain flexible, think ahead, several steps, including potential outcomes of the crisis. You have to engage your stakeholders and work closely to monitor social media and traditional media while remaining authentic and transparent. Any signs of trying to spin your way out of trouble, denying a problem, or worse yet, saying that nothing is going on is going to land you sideways. One of the other things we found in runbooks is and this is kind of a new and emerging area, is really starting to understand the difference between a policy and a procedure. Most of the runbooks I saw were just policies and said things like, we won't allow USB storage. Okay, that's great, but how are you not going to allow USB storage? On all systems or just some of them? Using what tools? Are you going to block it? Who's responsible for implementing it? And who's responsible for the exception process? Where are the logs stored? How, and articulating how, is so important, especially when things go sideways and maybe an investigation occurs. You can't just say you had a policy not to use USB drives, as an example. You have to be able to demonstrate you had maturity, that the organization knew and understood those things were prohibited and that the controls were in place to prohibit them. The same thing is true with incident response procedures. You know, it's one thing to say, oh, we will use industry best practices on our response. Or, you know, you would often see policies that say things like, you know, we won't say it's a breach. Okay, that's great. But how are you actually going to do that in reality? And how are you going to make sure your team is exercised on a regular basis to make sure that those policies and procedures are more than just an aspirational process and are actually mature muscle memory in your organization?
Absolutely.
All right, well, that finishes out our questions, Doug. I just want to personally thank you again for joining us today, and appreciate everybody's time. If anyone does have any follow-on questions, you're welcome to address those directly to us at CynergisTek, and we'll see if we can get them answered. Thanks again, Doug.
Thanks, Caleb. Have a great day, everyone.
All right, bye-bye.